Well, thank you everyone for coming along. We're going to be looking today at the second of the two lessons covering the different aspects of web services within inside Sage CRM. In the last lesson, we were looking at the SOAP-based web services. And this lesson is going to continue the story, but it becomes a little bit more complicated because here we're going to be looking not so much as more you can do with the SOAP-based web services, although they are very powerful. Instead, we're going to, in a way, take a step back and look at another form of API, one which in version 7.3, in the desktop version, actually can't do as much as the existing SOAP web services. But as we'll see when we look in its operation within the cloud, it represents the forward direction. So we're looking here, otherwise we've been looking at APIs, if you like, so far that have been to do with what is and what has been. In this lesson, we're looking very much at what's coming and how new things are being added into the program, how new features are being added into Sage CRM. So here we are, we're following up, we're in the lesson now that is, well, we are well through the material of the course. So we're on to lesson 17, and we have to start looking at the documentation and where we can find information about the topic that we're covering today. And at the heart of this, we're going to be looking at SData. Now, this is something called, SData is our implementation of a RESTful API. And if you hear the terms used, they're broadly interchangeable within context. So within a Sage environment, if somebody talks about SData, then it should trigger for you, oh, that is the RESTful web service. And if you hear about people using REST APIs within Sage and Sage products, they're probably talking about a SData-based protocol, because SData is Sage's implementation of a RESTful API. And first things first, we should look at where we get the information about this. So if I type in sdata.sage, and you can see you come across into the resources in here. This is in GitHub, where we've got lots of information about the SData, and you can see that there has been a development of the standard between SData 1.1 and SData 2.0. Now, if you're using version 7.3 of Sage CRM, which is the current released version, then you are using, or you have at your availability, version 1.1 of SData. If you're using the cloud, so if you're using cloud if I go off actually and log on, that's probably the easiest thing to do. If I come into a cloud instance and log on for you, what we'll find as soon as I've logged on, and it always takes a little while we're starting up the cloud instance, but once we're in, that's good. And now we're in, and what I'll do is I'll just switch across into the administration screen. If I go into the administration area and look within cloud at the external access area, you'll see that you've got here the information about, of course, the SOAP-based web services, but you also have indication that we're using two forms of the RESTful API, and you can see there's a note about the backward compatibility as well as the new SData 2.0 URL. So there are here some emphasis to say that we've got a development going on within the Cloud Edition, which is going to eventually be brought into the on-premise environment as well. Now, from a documentation point of view, there are areas in which we can go to get help within the community and within the resources available to us here. So in terms of, not only have you got this lesson, but in terms of reading around the subject, it's important to remember that you're not left to swing. There's lots of different examples, and if I look at SData Roundup, you can see that as we go to this particular summary of articles about the use of the SData provider, you'll find that the community as an area has got actually lots of different examples of using SData, including one especially useful resource, which we will come on to and mention a little bit later on, is if we look at SData examples, we'll see that there are examples available that you can download from the community and be able to experiment with the different query language. Now, that's obviously when we're dealing with fetching information and pulling information up, but nevertheless, it's quite interesting to look at how we achieve certain things just by looking at examples. So that's where you can get help and you can learn about this, and there are other lessons and around SData in here. But this is a type of web service which we will want to be able to experiment our understanding. So we'll need to be able to try things out before we start to code. And ultimately, we're talking about writing code to perform different tasks, whether that's to retrieve information or whether that's actually to insert, update, or delete. Now, how you work with a web-based environment is up to you. You could be writing and forming web requests using C# libraries, or you could be writing just within JavaScript. If I switch across here, we can see that we can start to think about the formulation of jQuery AJAX requests that are addressed at particular URLs. And you'll see that one of the things about using SData as a mechanism is that we have to start thinking very much about the verbs that we use for the interaction. Now, contained inside the Cloud Edition, there's a level of documentation that becomes very important to us because it will start to allow us to understand the shape of the requests that we make. And if I switch back into where I've got my Cloud Edition, you can see here I'm back inside looking at where I've come into the administration parts, and I'm looking at the external access of my cloud instance, and you'll see that there is a link to a RESTful API help. Now, if I click this, you'll see that it opens up a set of documentation with example mechanisms based on the SData 2.0 interface for all of the entities that it covers. Now, in the current release of version of the Cloud Edition, which happens to be 2015 R1, it only covers the main entities of company and person and their related entities, plus the additional entities that were added as a result of the builder. So it's starting to work with builder constructed entities and then other entities as well. But the chief thing here is that there is a mechanism to allow us to see how we use the API. And you'll see here this idea that we pass a resource to a particular URL framed in a particular way that will allow us to do some work. So even if it's a case of posting in some information to perhaps create a new company, we can actually see the types of information that we can pass in the form of the body. Now, that will take us so far. The idea that it tells us the endpoint and the formation that we can use and the construction of the message that needs to be sent. But we can go a little bit better than this and start using within our code some RESTful clients. Now, these clients allow you to play with the structures of the messages so that you understand how to construct the messages yourself. Now, I quite like the Swagger because this allows us to see all of the different fields that you might want to use. But personally, I use a add-on for Chrome called the Advanced REST client. And if you go into the apps and you look in the web store, you will find that very easily. So if I'm going into Advanced REST client, and you can see that there are a number of different REST clients within inside here, but I'm using, as you can see here, a very highly rated example of a RESTful client. And if I go back into the apps that I've installed for this, we see it here in my collection. I click onto my Advanced REST client, and you'll notice that one of the things about it is that you have this idea of different projects that you can use, allowing you to test different versions of the API in order to do different things. So going to a different endpoint and passing in different levels and types of authorization as well. So this is an environment that allows us to do experimentation, and all the way through this I'm going to be using this Chrome Advanced RESTful REST client application to experiment with the different ideas. But let's see if anyone has got any questions at this stage. Looks like no one's looking at any questions, so that's cool. We can carry on. At the heart of the understanding about the S-data as a form of REST is the idea that the HTTP protocol, which is used for the request response cycle between the whatever is the client and the CRM server, is that we're using the HTTP verbs themselves as the basis of the interaction with the system. If we know that we can imply a certain behavior, like get queries the state of the application, post modifies the state of the application, put is pushing or creating information into the system, and delete is obviously deleting information. These verbs within HTTP mean that we can start to include the HTTP method as part of the request to the server with a semantic meaning. And this is what representational state transfer, or REST, means. We're using the idea of the HTTP method to imply something on the server. And this is what we see. There's actually there's about 7 or so different mechanisms that HTTP supports, but we're typically using get, post, put and delete, although you'll find within Swagger it provides you with really quite a range of examples here in terms of what you can use. Patch as well, and you can see that it allows us to experiment with these. Our SData requests, when we make a request, whether it's from the RESTful client or REST client, or whether it's from just the browser URL, that URL has to be interpreted by IIS to redirect to where it's going to be interpreted. It's going to have to be sent across and redirected away from IIS to the Apache Tomcat server, and then any of the communication to the database goes through the level of that the web apps within the Tomcat web server. We can start to understand a little bit about this if in fact we just provide a URL to go to redirect to that instance. So if I type in here say CRM SData, I can go and request down to the level of my CRM instance, and you can see, by the way, the J is part of the understanding that when you've installed CRM on a server, this is part of the understanding of where it needs to redirect the request to. And this is now responding from the Apache server rather than simply from IIS. This is part of that redirect mechanism. But anyway, we are faced with this environment where the work for SData is handled by the Tomcat and Java technologies rather than by the EWare DLL. I'll emphasize that a little bit later on, because it's important to realize that we're dealing with an API that isn't being built on another API. And when we're thinking about what REST is in terms of the representational state transfer, this is a very simple example, but actually our examples are even better formed than many of the examples that you might find that explain REST. Here, in this particular instance, you can see how there is a verb being used inside the path. The whole idea is that we say HTTPS as the URL scheme, then going down to the authority, which is the domain that we're going to, and then there's a path. And the path typically will be to an endpoint which represents a noun. And that noun might be a company, it might be a quote, it might be a something. And as we can see in the examples that I downloaded, the idea is that we are going to a thing, and it's the method that we use, for example get, that implies that what we're doing is we're searching for a particular thing, where we're also providing it with a unique identifier. In this particular case, this example would retrieve a single person record. And you can see that we can phrase the types of requests with the expectation that we would be retrieving more than one record as well. So this idea is that the structure of the URL, as we got here, is implying that we're going to a named entity, and that we're passing the criteria within the URL that will either result in a single entry being returned or a data set being returned. And there's this idea is going to develop into a little bit more nuanced in a moment, but you can see that this is at the heart of the API that we have at the moment. So right now in version 7.3, if I look at version 7.3, you can see I can log on let's start this up, and I can now use within the context of my system S data. So I know that I've started this up. I can make requests into the system, and I can build my path. Let me just wait for that to finish. Good, that's started up. And if I want to continue with this, what we can see is that I can provide a request that goes down below where we have our instance to include within the path a description of the S data protocol that we're using. So here, for example, that Sage CRM is telling us that, or rather making a request to say, I expect to find S data that corresponds to the understanding of Sage CRM, as opposed to maybe a business management solution like Sage 300 or Sage X3. So Sage CRM here is what we're going down to. That step here indicates a database in another Sage product, but we don't work with multiple databases, so that represents that just remains as a hyphen. But now I want the company information, and I'm requesting something called the schema. Now that, by the way, has actually worked. If I view the page source, we can see that that has returned for me an XML document. And so that went in, it retrieved information and handed back. It just so happens that it looks very blank, but it has actually returned some information. And that S data pattern gets the information and returns it back to the browser. Now we can take advantage of some very clever and useful things. So where I've logged on into Sage CRM, and you can see here I can go to administration, and I can look to the fact that I've got different entities within the system. So I've got company here. I could start to change my URL to make sure that I retrieve not just the description of what the company looks like, but an actual company. So I could look for company 28, and I could also put in a call here. This is my authentication to indicate that I'm pulling back information from the company 28, which is Gatecom, and you can see the way in which that's returned, and we can see that I've passed in some authentication token to indicate that yes, I'm allowed to retrieve this information. Now if I right mouse click and view the source for this particular call, you can see that this is returned as an XML package, and that's going to be something that we will emphasize a lot about the development of the API. But you saw how quick it was, and it's very, very useful and very quick. Now we can take this idea of an individual entity being exposed, and within the API, within SData, and the definition of the objects, we can even make an individual view available. So if I look to a individual view inside the system, I might actually just to control a company to make it available for SData, and if I look to a view, and I might come down to a view like Jeff's company view, and I can see here that this could be made available to SData as well. So just as we can see here, this particular view is made available, so we can make any view that we own and that we've created available. And they become understandable, actionable. We can go and look for them within the paths that we write. And that means that you can fine-tune to a high degree exactly the information that you return from that API request. Now, the job of the schema, as you can see here, is to return XML that describes what fields are available and what about those fields. So the nature of those fields as to whether they're read-only, for example. That's a way of working out the rules associated with this particular, in this case, view. The way in which the paths are built follow a particular set of rules defined within the documentation. Now, I went into here the S-data documentation, and if you follow through in the core language and you come down in the documentation to look at the idea of the anatomy of an S-data URL, you should be able to find that there is a reference to the query language. And so you can see here the way in which we can make requests to an endpoint inside CRM or inside a Sage product that adheres to using S-data, and we can start to see how we would restrict the returns. And where we would have this written in SQL, so it translates in the fetch that we do into the S-data restriction. So you can see here we've got the select statement and the where statement. That where statement is very closely identifiable with the original S-data that we might need. But you can see the whole idea. We don't need to specify anything to say select, because we know that we're going to be issuing an HTTP GET, which implies the select. We don't need to say where it's coming from, because that's expressed within the path of the URL. We only need to express the fragment which contains the clause which restricts the data. Okay, let's see if we've got any questions so far. So far, this looks like people are happy with what we're looking at, and that's great. Now, this is all where we've talked about so far with this, just that example, and it's relatively straightforward. It's something within the advanced REST client we can experiment with. Here you can see I'm using S-data at 1.1. I just need to make sure that my, in this case, I'm going to my cloud instance. I've got my company in here. Just a note about authorization, though. When you're making requests, there are two ways in which requests can take place. One, we can go through a challenge and response. So we don't have to pass in any header information, in which case when the request is received there will be a challenge and we would have to provide the information, or we can work on the basis of preemptive authorization by passing the authorization, and there will be a token provided to us indicating that yes, we've logged on, and subsequent requests don't necessarily have to contain the same header information. Now you can see, by the way, here that I've got my header containing a base64 encoded header. If we look at the form version of this, you can see I'm passing in an authorization where it's in basic, and base64 we've got the string there. That basically is the username password string, and there are articles on the community which explain how you can programmatically do this, how you can encode usernames and passwords. Just by the way, if you are passing in usernames and passwords, one of the things that you should do is, as you can see here, make sure your instance of CRM is working with HTTPS. Okay, so if I choose to send there, we can see that goes off. That's getting this URL, comes back with a nice 200 error message indicating that everything has worked very nicely, and we can see that it's coming back in the form of Atom XML within the feed that is returned. All of that is read-only, but we are moving towards a point where within our Cloud Edition right now we have RESTful CRUD, create, read, update and delete, and not just read-only. And we already have a SOAP-based web service which we can carry out, create, read, update and delete. So what will the new REST CRUD, the S-Data CRUD, provide us? What advantage will it give us? Well, to answer this is to do with the way in which it's going to extend over all of the product, and it's not just limited to the basic actions, but we'll be adding more features. And one of the things to look at if you're looking and reading around the features of the cloud-based implementation is to consider the batch feature, which allows for a synchronous operation. So you don't need to be constantly doing that. You can set and submit a set of work to process for synchronization purposes, for example. So there's batch operations that you can submit. And we here have got just the fact that we log on to the Cloud Edition, and the Cloud Edition has a URL, and there are some realities that we need to look at. Now, Cloud supports SOAP-based web services just as it supports the S-Data web services. So we need to do some unpicking here, and the principal unpicking is around the idea of the eWare DLL. So anything that we're using that when we're using Sage CRM, and there's a reference to the eWare DLL, it means that we need to start thinking about the architecture that we've inherited. And Sage CRM is this hybrid product with many of the features being routed through the eWare DLL, and some of the features, or an rapidly increasing range of features being routed through the Tomcat stack of technology. Anything that is to do with the RESTful APIs goes to the Tomcat. Anything that to do with SOAP is directed at the eWare DLL. And the eWare DLL has particular ways of working, and around here it's the understanding of the way in which relationships are built and the way in which we work with new entities within the system. And new entities, as far as the cloud is concerned, is really a key thing to understand. The builder product, which is used to construct new entities, and for example, if I go and have a look at what I've got within my system and I look at customization, we can see in my system I've got two new entities added into the system, conference and conference session. These are example of entities that were created using the Sage CRM Builder. Now, the Sage CRM Builder is only applicable for cloud instances. And it's very much a simple environment, and there are when we consider the maintenance or use of entities through the builder, it's not at all like the way in which we construct entities using the advanced customization manager with the on-premise environment. So please bear that in mind, that the two ways of constructing, one on-premise and one in the cloud, are very different, and they have implications for the APIs. Now, when you're dealing with something like the Advanced Customization Wizard, we are constructing entities which work very much like the existing tables, and so the SOAP-based web services work fully with those. When we use the Sage CRM Builder, the way in which the entities are related to each other, because the whole idea that this has to be codeless and there are some simplifications that take place, there are limitations in the way in which you can use the SOAP-based web services with the entities because of the linking between the entities and some of the differences and support for data types. But this is not, by the way, something that is a limitation for the RESTful API. The SData works very well and works whether we are dealing with the structures within that might be created using the Advanced Customization Wizard or created using the Builder. Now, we are currently working with SData 1.1. So as I consider the entities and we carry out work, when we carry out work within the advanced client, we're using SData 1.1, and it's read-only. That's probably the most obvious limitation that we've got. Certainly this is a limitation that is not a limitation of SData per se. SData 1.1 supports full CRUD within its definition, but it had a very wide and very restrictive set about how this was to be accomplished, and within the Sage CRM environment it created an overhead for us that was somewhat problematic, and so we implemented the read-only mechanism, but we didn't implement the update, insert and delete, because we were able to use the SOAP-based web services around that. Now, SData 2.0 has reduced, from our developers' perspective, the amount of required essentials. So it's moved to a way of definition that is a much simpler thing, allowing our developers to move much more quickly in creating the API extensions that we've got within 2.0. And there are much more of a move away from theoretical basis to the actual practicalities of using the SData within a CRM or a business management solution. There's also been some improvements in the design as we've moved from version 1.1 of SData to 2.0. For example, there's closer adherence to the idea of the HTTP rules and the definitions of the different methods supported by HTTP. And one of the things that we will notice is that there's been a move away from having to worry about the Atom XML standard to, if we change my project here, so I'm working instead with pointing at a different endpoint now for getting hold of conferences. So if I go and get hold of a feed of conferences, this is going to a slightly different location, but when we do send this and retrieve the information, if you look down here, you'll see that instead of XML being returned, it's returning it as JSON. And JSON is JavaScript object notation, and I'll mention a little bit more about that in a moment. But it means that we've got a wider choice about what we can do and provide in terms of the end result. Now we're not facing SData 2.0 yet within the on-premise environment. This is only being introduced into the cloud environment at the moment, but it will come to us eventually, and so we'll have the question of what does this mean for us as far as upgrades and compatibility. The importance of compatibility has been identified as a major priority within the development, and we've got SData being used all the way through CRM. And so if anyone is going to discover and experience the pain of moving between SData 1.1 and SData 2.0 within a on-premise environment, this is for 7.3 or the new versions of 7 point whatever or version 8 as they're coming, we will find them, we will experience them, and so it has to be as painless as possible in the move over. So the idea is that SData 1.1 compliant implementation is automatically compliant to SData 2.0. Now, there's only a minor impact within Sage CRM. There is a reality that there is an impact, but it's only a minor one. If we consider what this path looks like up here, and we just consider this end bit of the request to the conference, well, that really doesn't change whether we are dealing with versions 1.1 or whether we are working with 2.0. The URLs are not changing, neither is the query language. So the examples that we've seen here, these would remain the same as we implement and use SData 2.0. Now, I keep on saying when it comes. Well, it has already arrived, and it's important to realize that we can start experimenting with this within the cloud edition of Sage CRM. From our development perspective, the major thing to emphasize is that the results become so much more usable to us and immediately usable to us because JSON is returned. We only have to think and look at the type of result when it's in XML. If we wanted to handle this as a result, as we look at all this, we would have to think about how we were going to parse and walk the tree of the XML node. From a JSON perspective, it becomes so much easier because it's an object, JSON standing for JavaScript Object Notation, and so we can use it almost directly inside our code once the object has been returned. We'll see in a moment exactly what I mean by that, but it is returned with a definition which makes it very easy to reference just with a simple access to a property of an object, any of the data returned by the fetches that we carry out with SData 2.0. So let's have a look at some of the equivalents. One of the things that we've got within our product is the requirement to work out what's exposed. In version 1.1 of SData, if we wanted to know what the data model was like, what fields were available, we would use schema. In SData 2.0, we use the prototypes keyword. So whereas we used to say, well, tell me what's available within schema, we now use prototypes, and that allows us to go and get hold of description of all of the structures within inside the system. But other than that, that's just about the major thing that you and I will experience. We just have to be aware that the path is somewhat different. Typically it's going to Sage CRM 2, but all of the other queries, they remain the same. So everything that we've got in here would work whether we were going against version 2.0 or 1.1. And you can see that we can prototype down to the individual views or to the individual tables that are the endpoint objects within our URLs. So this is talking about the something that I've already shown you, just is saying that when you make a request using SData 1.1 and you go against looking for an individual conference, we would get XML being returned, and when you go against SData 2.0 looking for the same conference, then you get JSON being returned, JavaScript object notation. So all of that then is written in a way which is much easier to understand as the properties of an object. So although the full standard supports the idea of we could have alternated between returning Atom and JSON, in fact what we're doing within version 7.3 and also within the cloud editions is only supporting JSON as the returned standard. And we have already seen that CRUD has been introduced into the cloud edition. That actually took place last year. 2014 R2 showcased that. We're now on 2015 R1. And 2015 R1 also has the batch capabilities as well. If you're still not entirely sure what I've been talking about when mentioning JSON, JSON is this type of structure when we see objects defined with these curly brackets arranged so that we have name value pairs or tuples, and this is very much like if we were writing things in JavaScript where we can support all forms of different objects. We'll support the idea of strings and numbers and booleans and null values, and also the idea that our own properties can be other objects themselves, either other objects with further tuples or objects which have got arrays or expressed as arrays. You can see here that this is the basic structure of an object. Now, you might write it a data package like the first set above. So where you've got the conference name, colon, Sage Insights, and conference name, colon, and then the date time expressed in UTC format. This is just as if we had said var my object equals, and what we've got here is an object being defined within the braces as a series of associated arrays. So we've got the name value pairs creating properties for that object with its value associated with it. And we would then be able to, where you have got all of these objects expressed in that braces form, we can take that return set, write it into an object. We can then reference it by simply saying my object dot property name. So right down the bottom of the screen there, it's got the idea of alert my object conf name, and we'd be able to use it. So these are our objects, and they provide us with sets of opportunities, and we've got here an example of how a tuple can actually contain the name value, where the value is an array of values as well. But even those objects, because an array is another object, can contain another object as well. So sub-objects can also be passed within the structures that we use. Now this is necessary for us if we want to start to, for example, linking entities together as we insert information, or as we update to change who information is assigned to, or what's the parental company, for example. So sub-objects need to be passed if we want to be able to manage references inside the CRM package through the API. Now let's see if we've got any questions before I step on a little bit further. I've had a question come in saying the JSON object that is returned is only in SData 2.0. Does that mean the current 7.3 on-premise does not have SData 2.0? Yes, it does mean that, Dwayne. So at the moment we only have SData 1.1 within 7.3, but we're talking about it now because it is in the cloud edition and it is coming imminently. I can't tell you when it's coming because I haven't seen the final roadmap, but it's coming imminently and inevitably inside the on-premise product. So in the later version we will definitely have SData 2.0, but at the moment we're working with SData 1.1, but we need to start thinking about what does this mean for the design of web service applications, because at the moment we're using SOAP for things, but in the future we will need to start thinking about the interaction using SData 2.0. Hopefully that explains the situation. Now, with the types of response, I've already started to talk about a couple of these: entry, feed, and diagnosis. Entry is where there's a single response. A feed is where there's multiple records returned, and a diagnosis is where there is a managed reference. Within the cloud, what we've got within 2.15R1 at the moment is interaction on the company and the person, in addition to all builder entities, and there's a batch capability as well. This is what we see if I went up to the Swagger, and we can see this here. So you can see the entities that are referenced. So if I shut these up, you can see we've got the idea of the company, conference session. These are my custom entities. We've got some linking entities and person. So these are the entities in which this is exposed. So the SData can be used fully on those structures within the cloud edition. But it's coming in 2016 later on in what we've got, where so it's not quite here within 2015, 16. So I say that again. Later on in this year, for the cloud, it will have it on all entities, and also imminently, as a matter of priority, it will be made available within the on-premise as well. Now, everything that I know I'm indicating there's a sense of urgency to get it into the on-premise, but please don't take it as an absolute gold standard that it will be. I'm not promising anything other than indicating that we know we need to move in this direction quickly, because that represents really the future of what we want to do with remote interaction. Now, let's do some demoing and understanding what we're doing, because this is all about interacting and getting in and doing stuff with the system. If I go to my REST client and think about how to get some information, this is fairly easy to understand. If I want to get an individual conference, and by the way, here if I go into my CRM interface, if I go into where I've got the search capabilities and search for conference, and I find conference. Yeah, I've got a few conferences inside the system. So these are all sort of experiments that I've carried out with different companies, and it's probably a good idea if when I come to wanting to retrieve a particular conference, I actually have a look at what its unique identifier is. So if here's a particular conference, it's not it's a conference for a company called A Biscuit and Sons, and we can see that in this case the primary key value for the company, or for the conference I should say, is 1038, and we've got our record ID, record ID is 57, is the value of the conference. So if I go back into where we've got our REST client and I look for 57 as the conference here, and I send that, we can see that we've got our raw output, and you can tell that it has identified it as being this A Biscuit and Sons conference with all of the information contained in there. So if I look at this, this is what it looks like in the returned information. All of those different nested elements. Can I show you what I mean? If I look at the raw information again, and I consider just copy to clipboard, and I jump across into a browser. Now it doesn't need to be anywhere. If I hit F12 here and go to the console, I can clear this out. You can see that what I can do is saying var my obj equals, and then I can paste that object in there. So I've put that return. This is what we can do with the idea of JSON. So var, I get a result, and the whole point about taking this is if I look at my obj now and I'm interested, I've got all these different properties of the object that I can actually see about. So company in here is itself another object which I can go down to look at and see which company this is for. So you can start to understand the attraction, the huge attraction of what JSON is going to give to us. So we're going to be able to move much more quickly in our interactions. So that's just an easy get of some information. Now this is independent of whether we're needing to think about whether an individual item is returned or a set of items. This is the idea of a feed. It's just more information is going to be returned. And here I run down and get the feed for the conference and send that. and we get within our JSON this more complex, larger scale amount of information. So in my case, I haven't got huge amounts of conferences, but it's enough. I don't need to worry. I'm not going to do the same thing as before, because I think that that's actually unnecessary in this. But you can see that idea. Now, if I make a request though, and there's an error, this is likely to be of two forms. So here, for example, if I return to my advanced REST client, and if I change this so that I'm passing in nonsensical information, so if I send that, that actually has worked. It's because it's ignored that. If I send that, yes, so here I've managed to produce for myself an error. This error is an example of an error that has occurred within the context of our server before it's got into the application. So you can see an application error has occurred on the server. Now, a more sophisticated error is if you've got through but you've made not within the syntax of the URL, but you actually have something that looks like this, where the object we know doesn't exist. We will get something called a diagnosis. So the diagnosis is a formal error. It's the same bad request as far as the general message comes back, but it's been captured inside the CRM object rather than simply it's a server error that the server hasn't been able to cope with. So if that hopefully makes sense, in the sense that you've got these different types of errors that may occur. Now, we've set the scene within this understanding of the way in which the request is made to move towards CRUD. And in order to carry out tasks, we can be quite sophisticated. I can insert a new record into an entity within inside CRM very neatly. I could up here within inside Swagger look at the idea of how we might insert a new conference in here. So if I look at the idea of creating a resource using a post, and we can see that we could structure it much like this. So we can see the body that we might use. But it's the endpoint that I'm interested in. Well, here I'm using my idea of the advanced REST client to allow me to do this. So if I look at the idea of posting in a conference, we can see that what we have to think about is the URL to which we're going. Now, the only thing that's different when we're doing this is that we're indicating that we're posting and not getting. When it comes to the code that we write, for example, we might write code using here jQuery. I'm indicating that I'm posting, and I'm going in to what is the conference. So this is programmatically how we would do it, or this is an example of programmatically how it would be done, where we can see this is how we can test it within a test environment like the REST client. So you can play around with whether it's a get or whether it's a post. This is a post. And then we have to post a JSON object, JavaScript object notation. So this is a JavaScript object that's being posted in, which contains the tuples, the name value pairs of the properties that we want to set for that record, the fields that we want to set for that record. And you can see this is going to set the user ID as 1, the name of this. So let's actually call this Jeff's conference, and I send that. So in it goes, and I've got a new conference that has been created. So if I was to look for that, I would find Jeff's conference with an ID of 58. Now, if we want to expand this, if we want to change this, if we want to do things, then we can do that as well within the scope of the API. We can link to an existing entity, or to an existing custom entity. In the case of this, like we can post in a conference session, we could have a look. We've created here the idea of that's 58, and if we look to posting in an entrance to an individual conference session, we can see the way in which we would need to reference this is to say, oh, there's the conference, and we're setting its key value to be 58 or to whatever. And equally, I can start to maintain value. So I can add links and remove links or change links within inside anything that we're doing. We can actually create links and relationships between these structures. So I can update an entry. So where we were working with a conference 58, I think, if I go into CRM and search again, type in Jeff's conference, you can see there's Jeff's conference that has just been created. And if we want to edit this, for example, we want to change an aspect of this, update its name, for example, we can do that with the Advanced REST client as well. So if I look at the idea of an update, this actually has an update of a conference session, but actually I will do this so that we're updating the conference. And in my example, inside CRM, this was record 58. So that's record 58. And if I double check what its name is, conf is the prefix conf name. You can see how I'm using there I'm using the idea here of our update. So if I look at the put, really, if I look here, I can see what this is going to be interpreted to. So conf is whatever the string name is I'm using. I'm using post because actually it will allow me to post this. So if I write conf name, I'll leave that as Wibble, and let's do Wibble. Let's do Wibble hello, and I send that. We can see that we've had a 200, so that is indicating that it should have updated it. And if we look at CRM and I refresh this, we'll see how it changes the name of the conference. Does it change from Jeff's conference to Wibble Hello? And in fact it has. So that's showing us that we've got the CRUD capabilities of not only have we created there, but we've also posted an update into the system. And we can break relationships between, because any of these are simply properties which are interacted with using the SData API. And all of these different examples that I'm giving, if you go on to the community and you have a look at the URLs, you'll see that there are worked through examples of making use of SData within inside the system, and these are talked about within those. And finally, if we want to delete something, delete an entry within a custom entity or remove the individual record, then we can do that. So if I wanted to delete my 58, then I can look down and where we've got to delete an entry, and here in this particular case it's not deleting the conference session, it's just conference, and it was 58. You can see it's there using the verb delete. And just to make sure that if I'm not doing something magical, this is something that you would be able to know, because you would be able to have a look at the way in which we use delete in here. You can see that it's just a question of specifying what the key is and passing that in, and that will handle the delete for us. And so now if I send that, we get a 200 to indicating it's okay, and our return set is an empty object. And if I refresh my screen, we should actually find that this record, there we go, because I've tried to access a record that doesn't exist. So I should go and search for Wibble Hello up here. Oh, for some reason it hasn't marked everything correctly. I'll have to look at what I've done there within the URL that I've sent. Okay, I think that probably there's a mismatch between one of the fields that I should have marked. But that's all possible to do. We've just delete that, and the last thing that we have to consider is, how does this affect us in our coding? How does this affect us when we are carrying out action using things like the client-side API? Now remember what I was saying about how as we move from version of SData 1.1 to version SData 2.2, compatibility is a priority. That's true here as well. The idea is that we're used to using the client-side API. We can use it inside the on-premise. We can use it inside the cloud product, and the client-side API is going to absorb all of the changes for SData 2.0. So you will see it extended to allow for CRUD action, but where we currently code, for example, if you want to add a tooltip to the company name on the opportunity summary screen, it would look a little bit like this. We would write some code that used the method crm.sdata, indicating that we're going to a particular company with a particular ID, and we wanted to then invoke a particular function, which happens to be the success company. And the success company function here is able to cope and work with whatever is the returned data object for that particular query. So we're literally here showing that using Ajax to show the tooltip as something hovers over it. That is using 1.1, but you wouldn't know it because it masks it from you. and when we move over to 2.0, it wouldn't change. It would carry on operating like this. At the moment, though, we don't have CRUD capabilities within the API, but that's coming, and it has to come because we have to start to work in the real world. So here, for example, if I go to a company, and let's actually go ahead and create a new company. I'm going to call this Abacus. One, two, three Limited, or that's L23. I want 1, 2, 3, and I enter that. So I've got a new company. I'll fill in the mandatory information. 1 Main Road. Put the main road in here. Run down here, and I'll put Jeff Richards as my username. And I fill in the information, and I can choose Save. So I've got a new company in here, and what we'll see is that I've got a little button saying Quick Conference. Well, in my system, if I go into administration and I go and have a look at my primary entities where I've got company and look at the screens, I've got some code inside the screen. You can see it highlighted here. Maybe a little bit strange to look at, but actually this is the code that I've brought across into here, and what it's doing is it's going to add a button for me with a function that will insert a new conference automatically for this company. So this is the sort of thing that we can do. So you can see the button is added there, and the behavior is going to be available to me. So if I go quickly back to where I had created this Abacus 123 Limited, and I've got this button that says Quick Conference, we can see that this has now created this new custom entity, inserting it into the interface. You can basically, it's done that. And that then is this idea that we can code right now and get used to using the concepts of inserting our codes into what we're doing. Now, I don't want to just finish yet. I just want to have a look and see. Yes, we can see the conference has gone in. It belongs to that, so the relationship has been maintained. And this is sort of the real world example that we're doing. You can see the way in which we construct our conference. We know who it belongs to, and we know which company it belongs to as well. All done through JavaScript, passing and defining a JavaScript object, JSON object, passing that into the URL with the correct post, with the correct authorization as well. Okay, let's see if anyone has now any questions as we've come to the end of our discussion.